Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chinese Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Tech and Trade. I'm your moderator, Tim Huang, this morning, and very, very excited for the panel today. We have a really great group of experts that have been put together for this discussion. Maybe as a preamble, the question of sort of AI, China, and tech and trade is, of course, a really big and important topic. And like many big important topics, it is one where there have been hot takes and cold takes and, lots and lots of discussion. But I think frequently, it's been hard to kind of get to sort of the heart of some of these issues and really get some kind of ground truth on how these topics are kind of evolving. And I think one of the things that we will aim to do in the panel today is to dive deep with experts that have kind of looked into this issue. And really hope to give everybody kind of tuning in a sort of good sense of what's actually happening on the ground. I think one of the things we can definitely do with this panel is to kind of clear out a lot of misconceptions that have gathered around this issue. And I think really kind of calibrate sort of the policy questions that are really kind of emerging in these debates and these discussions. So the way we're going to do this panel will be fairly conversational. I'll bring sort of each of the speakers in with sort of an initial starting question. But then the idea is for the panelists to actually really talk amongst themselves in some ways. I really want to kind of make this as sort of conversational and as engaging as possible, particularly as we enter, I guess, year 3 of Zoom panels. I think it'll just make for a more entertaining format that way. One thing to do before we get started is to call your attention to the Q&A feature that you'll see actually at the bottom of your screen. That Q&A function is open. And so to the extent that speakers are talking, making particular points, things that you want to engage on, feel free to drop a question in there. And what I will do as moderator is kind of be monitoring that stream of questions, and we'll sort of bring them in as needed. I was saying to the panelists before we got started, I sort of hate the presentations where like everybody talks for like 20 minutes and then you just do like a bunch of Q&A. I think the goal here is to really make for sort of a dynamic and interesting conversation where the ideas are really kind of bouncing off one another. So let's begin with the first of our panelists, Matt Sheehan. Matt's a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where his research covers global technology issues with a focus on China. His research projects explore China's artificial intelligence ecosystem, the future of Chinese technology policy, and the role of technology in China's political economy. And he's the author of The Trans-Pacific Experiment: How China and California Collaborate and Compete for Our Future. So Matt, I would like to kind of just begin by sort of setting the scene a little bit. There's this adage that all politics is local. In some ways, I think all technology is local, and also all technology policy is local in some sense. And so I'm wondering if you could sort of kick us off with sort of a kind of quick, 3 to 5 minute, although I accept the absurdity of this task, a quick 3 to 5 minute review of basically how AI sort of fits into China's sort of domestic policy and sort of policies around kind of national competitiveness, right? What is it that's happening within the borders of China that make AI such a high priority? And how does it sort of fit into sort of the government's kind of national strategy there?
Sure. Thanks a lot. Thanks to all the other panelists. These are all people that I learn from on the regular. I'll just dive in and try to give something concise here. So when I think about how China, specifically maybe the Chinese government, views AI, I go back to a phrase where I forget where I heard it first. It might have been from Jack Clark in his newsletter, but describing AI as an omni-use technology. We often are very stuck in the kind of Cold War, like everything is dual use. It's a rocket engine, but it's also a whatever truck engine. I don't know. And I think AI is different than that in that it's really very, very foundational and can be put to, just about as many ends as you can imagine, other than maybe the deeply like interpersonal. And I think the Chinese government sees it that way. I think they see AI as kind of an all-purpose tool for achieving their political, economic, social goals. That's kind of a bland statement when said that way, but it's maybe I'll kind of put it in opposition to a couple other things. I think one of the trickiest things to understand is, does China kind of pursue AI for AI's own sake, or pursue it for sort of leadership in and of itself, or does it pursue it for a specific goal? I think there's a little bit of a tension in the Chinese system, with the tension being, for a long time, they've viewed technology writ large as a key to the kind of development of China. Goes back Deng Xiaoping, like the four modernizations. There's a lot of faith that science and leading in science and engineering and technology will be what helps China catch up, restore itself to its once great place. So there's kind of this overriding like belief in the power of technology. But then what we see in sort of actual fact is it tends to be they want AI for specific uses. They want AI for, in a lot of cases, we focus on the social control elements, the surveillance elements. But I think maybe the one that gets overlooked a lot is AI as kind of like an all-purpose lever for leveling up the Chinese economy. You go back sort of 10 years, there's a lot of discussion of Chinese economy. It's kind of running out of its initial growth dividend. The population is aging, the wages are going up, is it going to lose its spot as factory of the world, that type of stuff. And I think Chinese leadership sees technology or sees AI, but other emerging technologies, 5G, whatever you're into these weeks, they see these as levers for upgrading like the manufacturing and industrial, agricultural, urban ecosystem. Can advanced manufacturing, can intelligence robotics, computer vision, can that essentially give China another 10 to 15 years of being factory of the world, even while all these other factors kind of come into, are working against China. For urban, life, I spent 5 years living in Chinese cities. There's a lot of things that could be improved there. And they see AI as kind of a technological solution for a lot of that, for traffic management, for public safety, for all these things. And so it's very, it's very kind of purpose driven, and we want this technology to help us achieve our economic, political, social goals.
Right, but it's like primarily an instrument of kind of like economic revitalization, or like as an economic offset, I guess, to some of the gravitational things that are happening in the economy. Yeah,
I mean, there are so many forces pulling within China that it's hard to just say like that is the one thing. I'd say maybe that's the thing that is most underrepresented in our sort of discourse about it. And I'll just flag one more thing before wrapping up. I think the interesting tension, and one that I'm kind of keeping my eye on, is the tension between AI for applications, AI for specific kind of use cases, and the pursuit of AI because we just want to be at the global frontier and we want to push out kind of what we often in the US call like curiosity-driven research, or just paying researchers just push out those frontiers, and we'll just we'll have faith that one day this will pay dividends. I think there's not as much of a tradition of that type of research in China, particularly within China's big technology companies. They've been scrapping for their lives in a highly competitive environment ever since they were born. Whereas, companies like Google, they came out of academia, they kind of always had this heavy research arm to it. And Chinese companies, because in a lot of ways they look to the US and elsewhere for inspiration or for models, a lot of them in the early days of the kind of AI boom, they said, hey, no, we're going to set up our Tencent research, we're going to set up the Alibaba Damhua Academy. But a lot of those things have struggled, some of them have been shut down, some of them maybe haven't been quite as productive, some of them have been. Baidu continues to do a lot, and there's some new ones like the Beijing Academy of Artificial Intelligence. So I would just kind of put that as something to watch in the future. We've got this, very kind of purpose-driven, we want to apply AI to all these problems, lever up our economy, restore China to its position. And then we've got this desire to be at that global frontier of research, but not as many kind of historical roots to that. And I think that's going to be an interesting kind of tension going forward, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. So I think it's really helpful. And I think you've picked up on two themes that I do want to return to, I think, in this conversation. I think two important nuances here that you pointed out. I think one of them is basically the distinction between like AI as a form of like a technology that you apply versus AI as something you're pursuing as a matter of basic research, right? And I think those get confused a lot in the discussion. The other one, I think, which is a really key one, is I think I do want to address the question of like whether or not it even makes sense to think about China's policy in the space, insofar as there's so many actors within China that have very different interests with regards to this technology. I think we can talk about whether or not that's even a coherent category, right, to think about like sort of China's kind of approach to this stuff. So to bring in our second panelist, Helen, I'd love to call on you for the second question. And just to give a quick bit of introduction, Helen Toner is Director of Strategy and Foundational Research Grants at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. She previously worked as a senior research analyst at Open Philanthropy, where she advised policymakers and grant makers on AI policy and strategy. Toner lived in Beijing, studying the Chinese AI ecosystem as a research affiliate of Oxford University's Center for the Governance of AI, and she is a member of the board of directors for OpenAI. So Helen, welcome. So I think I really want to kind of build on sort of Matt's comments, right? I sort of made that joke earlier that all technology policy is local. And one way of thinking about what Matt just told us a little bit about is situating AI in sort of like the domestic kind of AI context of what China is dealing with, right? Issues of, for example, economic revitalization. But I'm wondering if you can give us a little picture about how some of those trends might play out beyond the borders of China, and basically the sort of international picture, right? Which is, okay, we have a little bit of a sense of what the mechanics are maybe now of what's happening inside the country. But I would love to kind of hear about your take on like how we should think about sort of like the international picture, sort of like China and AI, and now, you know, all the things that happen outside of its borders. Again, I'll recognize the hilarity of trying to do that in 3 to 5 minutes, but if you can kind of paint a picture, we can sort of dive into it as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to be here. Really glad to be part of this panel. So I think maybe a good place to start would be thinking about how China sees its current position on the world stage and how AI fits into that. And I think an important thing to understand here is that from China's perspective, they think of themselves as having been sort of a great power for much of China's history, and then having had kind of a real lull or difficult period kind of around the time of the Industrial Revolution, or actually, as they sometimes put it, they think of themselves as having perhaps missed the first 3 industrial revolutions. I never know quite how to slice it. I think the common way is like the first one was the steam engine, the second one was electrification, and the third one was the digital revolution, something like that. Anyway, but there have been 3 that China thinks it sort of missed as a country. And at a high level, and at sort of from a very zoomed out perspective, I think the Chinese leadership sees artificial intelligence and some other emerging technologies that are coming now, maybe biotechnology, maybe quantum technologies, as an opportunity for China to really not only participate fully in this 4th industrial revolution, but perhaps even to lead it or be at the forefront, and in some ways kind of come back to what they see as a more sort of natural or typical historical state of being kind of one of the big powers in the world, if not the biggest power in the world. So I think that is kind of an overarching lens through which they're seeing this current period, which obviously relates to the historical contingencies of where Chinese economic development has been, and the fact that they are now at a point where they can invest heavily in basic research, and they have world-class universities and things like that, which was not true say 30 years ago. So that's kind of how I think about kind of the big picture positioning here. And then in terms of what they're doing about that, I mean, I do think that Matt's kind of underlying thesis of we tend to underemphasize the importance of how AI can contribute to domestic economic growth for China. I do think that's like an incredibly important piece of why they are prioritizing things here. But they are certainly also thinking about how it affects their place in the world stage. So there, and as we've also already kind of touched on a little bit, there's different ways that can look. One piece is on the sort of basic research side. So we are seeing, lots of investment in academia, in state key labs and other kind of government connected institutions. Lots of partnerships with industry on basic research, and really starting to see, it's very much the case that Chinese research labs are contributing to kind of the cutting edge of research in machine learning, deep learning, across a range of different areas on the basic research side. And then you also have on the more applied side, or industry, what kinds of products are being built, what kinds of things are being sold. China is certainly also trying to be kind of a key player there. And I think one area that really stands out there, I mean, as Matt said, AI is kind of an omni-use technology. It can be used for all kinds of things. One area that stands out immediately if you look at China is, of course, this kind of biometrics, facial recognition side of things. I think that is really an area where many countries that have sort of traditionally strong basic research in AI have various qualms and restrictions and ethical norms that have prevented them from kind of pushing that technology full steam ahead. And as I'm sure listeners are familiar, the Chinese government doesn't necessarily see things that way. And so I think there's just been a lot more sort of both license and also kind of active support within China for making large data sets of citizens, ID card, the photos on their ID cards and things like that. available to companies to push that technology forward. Not to say that there aren't, U.S. and European companies that are doing facial recognition. There obviously are. Clearview AI being an example of a company that has just scraped, tons of images off the web. So it's not that China is unique in this regard, but I think it's one example of an industry area where they're particularly strong and where they have therefore, Chinese companies have therefore performed particularly well on the world stage. And one way that connects into sort of broader, maybe kind of national Chinese strategy is what gets called the Digital Silk Road, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative of China trying to begin to position itself almost in a way, you could think of it as, looking at the U.S. and the way that the U.S. industry is sort of embedded all around the globe, and China trying to figure out kind of, is there a way that we could do something similar to that? Is there a way that we could not just, only be selling things to domestic consumers? And so obviously, we don't have to talk about Belt and Road here, but, huge initiative, building infrastructure all around the developing world. And the digital Silk Road is a digital component of that, which relates to selling sort of smart city technology, which includes sort of surveillance technology along with other kinds of tools, and China really attempting to position its companies as sort of international leaders and as really excellent potential partners for different governments on that front. So I don't know, there's a lot more to say here. I guess one last point I'll make is I think it's, obviously everyone's familiar with the Great Firewall, and obviously kind of the primary purpose of setting up that Great Firewall from the perspective of the Chinese government was for censorship and information control, but it has had this really interesting other effect. I actually don't know, other panelists might know how well this effect was sort of predicted and planned by the Chinese government, of basically being a protectionist measure as well, in terms of really creating space for Chinese tech companies to grow and develop a market and develop, the kinds of network effects that are so important for internet companies. And of course, because AI is interconnected with with everything else that relates to digital technology, that has meant that China has had this crop of sort of national champions or successful domestic internet companies in a way that, for instance, I think Europe currently, feels the lack of. I think Europe feels, significant parts of EU leadership feel pretty frustrated that European citizens are so, I don't want to say reliant on, but so deeply used to using US technology like Facebook and Google and Microsoft and Amazon and so on. That's not the case in China. So there's been this interesting sort of space for Chinese companies to grow there, which then has implications for their AI industry, because that kind of data and those kinds of capabilities are, good foundations for future AI development. I will leave it there, but yeah, lots more to say.
Yeah, and a lot more to dig into, and stuff that a little similar to Matt's comments, where I really want to kind of like pick up on it when we get to the discussion phase. What's intriguing, I think, Helen, about your comments that makes me think a little bit about is that, we hear a lot of these discussions about like digital authoritarianism, right? And like, if you dig into it, it's basically like, well, why are they being so authoritarian? It's like, well, because they're authoritarians. Like, there's a little bit of a circularity in that argument. But what's so intriguing is like, I think this really match of things where it basically turns out that like the drive for economic revitalization, the drive for like building successful businesses, kind of goes in hand with a lot of the technology deployments that we'd identify with like digital authoritarianism, right? That like basically like, one reason for enhancing all these facial technologies, face detection technologies, is that you want to enhance state control. But on the other hand, it may also just be because like you want those companies to become world-leading companies that are like, depended on by all sorts of people outside of your borders. And it's sort of interesting kind of thinking about like how those two sort of blend as different sort of incentives.
Yeah, and there's also a weird kind of intersection of, okay, if you have some large block of liberal democratic companies that is explicitly holding back in this area, what a market opportunity. So it's sort of, both as a political and an economic decision to be able to jump in and fill that gap.
That's right. And it's like kind of like, I mean, this happens a lot in policy land, is like the face and the vases effects, right? Which is like, well, is it driven by economics or is it driven by politics? Like the answer is of course a little bit of both, but like, it's interesting to think about like those moves being framed pretty legitimately, like from one point of view or the other. Like I think they're equally valid interpretations of kind of what's going on. So Emily, I'll pick on you next, if I may, to do the usual preliminaries on introduction. So Emily Weinstein is a research fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, focused on US national competitiveness in AI and machine learning technology and US-China technology competition. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and at the National Bureau of Asian Research. In her previous role at CSET, Weinstein conducted research on China's science and technology ecosystem, talent flows, and technology transfer issues. Emily, thank you and welcome. You know, we have talked a lot in the last few minutes between Matt and Helen's comments about sort of like the economic motivations for China's AI drive, right? In part, you know, Matt told us a little bit about like, okay, well, we have all these kind of factors in the Chinese economy that are causing it to slow down. And really one thing that China, again, we can talk about whether or not it's even a coherent category at all, is so interested in this technology is that it's a way of kind of like revitalizing economic growth and competitiveness. And Helen talked a little bit about the kind of international implications of building these national champions, which again are kind of connected to this drive for economic growth. Can I start with the question of just like whether or not you think that's working? Like, is all this work in pushing AI like achieving the end that presumably China wants to achieve in driving economic revitalization? Like, do you buy that argument? And if so, you know, like, do you think that, how do you think that influences, I think, like the balance of economic competition, I guess, between, say, the US, China, and Europe? Again, hilarious to do it in 3 to 5 minutes, but I'll give you the floor and run with it.
I was going to say, thank you for starting with an easy question for me.
Yeah, sure.
Appreciate it. So yeah, thank you very much. And I really wanted to kind of double down first on a point that both Helen and Matt made about the fact that AI and AI development is so weaved throughout all of China's development plan. So if you look actually at the 2017 New Generation AI Development Plan, that was China's big kind of push into modernizing its AI industry. You see AI talked about in the context of everything. So, you know, obviously military, which I know Jeff is going to talk about in a little bit, military, national security, as well as intelligence. So looking both at national security domestically and overseas. You see it in education, you see it in poverty alleviation, you see it in manufacturing. It spans the entire gambit from, it spans the entire gamut of Chinese society. So because of that, I think there are areas where it's working and areas where it's not. And I want to also start off with saying that, you know, it's kind of hard to talk about China technology competition without bringing up like the concept of decoupling. It's kind of like the elephant in the room. And I know, Tim, we can talk about this more later too. But I think one of the pieces that often gets overlooked when we're talking about US-China tech competition is that this is not a bilateral issue. This is something that really needs to, that really encompasses everyone around the world. So if we were to try and decouple, or if, you know, and China's been decoupling arguably for years, some people point to Made in China 2025, that came out in 2015. But I would say, you know, it's often discussed in this kind of US-China vacuum. And I think we need to talk more about the implications for, I would say, broader you know, implications for countries in Africa, Southeast Asia. I would say Europe. It would all of these places would really feel would feel if the U.S. and China continued down the kind of really tough decoupling route. It also obviously, like I said, I think will hurt both the U.S. and China in various ways. And I think there's a really interesting report that was actually censored from Peking University that came out about a month or two ago that actually argued, and this is from the head of the Institute for International and Strategic Studies, it's IISS, but the Chinese one at Peking University, that argued that decoupling actually would hurt China more in the tech space than it would hurt the United States. So in terms of connecting this back to your question, Tim, about kind of how has China been pushing forward, I would say they're making progress, but as demonstrated by so the author of that censored paper was Wang Jise. As he argues, China's still at the point where they are so reliant on the US for talent, investment, just general technological know-how and collaboration, that any amount of decoupling would really hurt China. And I think CSET has done a few papers looking at different aspects of China's relationships, both I would say, or China's tech relationships, both I would say in the academic realm as well as in the investment realm. And in the academic side, I'll just throw out a few things quickly. One of our CSET colleagues, Jack Corrigan, did a great paper that looked at Chinese university rankings and how they fit kind of more globally. And I would say the trend that you see with rankings, I think, is a trend we'll go back to a lot in this conversation. It's this idea that China has made significant progress, but is still not where it wants to be. It's still not at the point yet where it is competing effectively with US counterparts. So in the context of Jack's paper, he talked a lot about universities like Tsinghua and others that are top universities in China are starting to reach higher levels in international university rankings, but they're still not at the same level as US universities. We see this, and I'm going to keep, I flagged a few different points from a few CSET papers because we've done a lot on this. In terms of Chinese academic collaboration, specifically in STEM and AI research, we see China collaborating internationally at a much lower level than any of the other leading countries. So the US is collaborating with countries in the European Union, collaborating with Australia and other countries, and China tends to kind of stick to itself. And as everyone I think on this panel would agree, and I think it's kind of an understood assumption at this point that, in order to progress in science and technology, particularly AI, you have to collaborate internationally. You can't do it alone. So the fact that China, wants to pursue or wants to continue improving its basic research capabilities, but won't collaborate internationally, I think is something that's going to really hurt them, and I think continues to hurt them moving forward. The last piece I'll just make in terms of the conversation on investment, I think this is another really important indicator when we're talking about China's progress in artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. But one of the things we're seeing too is that China is the largest investor in its AI ecosystem currently. And there's some CSET data that's going to come out more on that in hopefully the coming months, knock on wood. But the US is close behind. So if you were to take out US investment, and I know there's conversations now going around Washington about some type of outbound investment restrictions or outbound investment screenings to look at US money flowing into Chinese emerging technology companies. I think China would be hurt significantly by the lack of not only just pure capital, particularly from venture capital companies, private equity. I mean, the money is coming from anywhere. You can't point to one part of the US economy and say, you're at fault or you're the one doing this. It's everyone. But so not only would it hurt China just purely on a capital front, but it would also really hurt China in terms of losing the kind of tangible or tacit knowledge that you're getting from the conversations with US investors, both folks in venture capital, and I think Matt has looked at this more than I have, I think at this point, but the conversations that happen between a Chinese startup company and some of the US venture capital companies, especially those really focused in emerging technologies, are really invaluable for these Chinese startups. They need a better understanding of the investment landscape. They need a better understanding of kind of their trajectory as a company, who their competitors are, other things like that, where their technology stands in the marketplace. So I won't comment on whether or not, I think this is a good thing or a bad thing. We can get to that later, but I would say just overall, again, China is pushing forward, and you can see it in terms of, the big government pushes in, pushing the universities. Helen talked about education reform and all of that, moving everything up, trying to improve domestic capacity. I mentioned again that China is the largest investor in its own AI industry, but again, it's still not at the point where they want to be. And we're coming up on 2025, which China likes to mark these kind of 5-year points for progress. So I think it'll be really interesting to see where they're at come 2025 and see if they've reached some of their goals. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, absolutely, Emma. That's really helpful. And yeah, it actually, you made me want to coin a new term, which is like S&T bros. Like in the sense that I feel like when we get into a lot of these competitions, there are conversations, like S&T bros is like the position of we just got to win. We just got to win this science and technology thing. And I think what's so great about your comments is I think it sort of smashes the idea that it's basically what do you mean by winning here, right? And I do think that one of the really interesting outcomes that might occur, given all the troubles that you're talking about China's ability to kind of catch up, is that, Helen laid out these kind of 2 goals for us, right? In terms of China's sort of international aspect to AI, one of them is sort of this prestige goal, right? And the other one is sort of this economic revitalization goal. And what's interesting is that it's possible potentially for China to win one of those goals, but not the other, right? That it's possible that the universities are hitting all the vanity stats. They're producing so many great papers. They're really advancing the state of the basic research. But it actually turns out for many reasons, like its ability for those companies to be able to apply and like win in international markets may actually end up being really limited, right? And I think there's the kind of this really interesting distinction about like, yeah, what does winning mean actually in this context?
I would also just point out too that China also, because of the size of its market, a lot of these AI companies in China don't even need the international market. They can purely hit their monthly and quarterly and annual goals just by staying in China's domestic industry. So I think that's another really interesting point when we're talking about what is winning. But
totally, yeah. And I think that's like, again, like another interesting distinction is like the scenario where like, you know, Chinese companies are able to like win internationally versus win in the sense that they're larger than US companies, but purely domestically, right? Like that's another totally valid outcome that you could think about winning, right? But like there's all these different things you could be maximizing for, I guess is what I'm trying to point at. So Jeff, I want to bring you in as kind of our last speaker here. So I'll do the introduction. So Jeff Ding is a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation, sponsored by Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. He is a research affiliate with the Center for the Governance of AI at the University of Oxford. And Ding is also an incoming professor at the George Washington University in fall 2022. And congrats, I didn't actually know about that. Jeff, you know, I think your sort of question that I want to pose to you, I think really builds off of kind of what Matt started with, which is sort of this idea of AI as kind of like an omni-use technology, right? In the same way that I've been kind of like beating the drum for the last few comments on like, does it make sense to even think about what like China's strategy is in a monolithic sense? I think similarly, we often get wrapped around the axle in thinking about AI as like a monolithic thing, right? We're like, are they winning in the AI? And like that statement actually doesn't actually make any sense. And so I think the thing I'd love for you to kind of bring into this conversation, or maybe a good place to start, is to think about and talk about sort of some of your work, thinking about the military applications of the technology. We've been talking a lot about sort of like the drive for AI here being largely motivated by economic incentives. And I would love for you to kind of think about or talk about how these two domains are related or distinct. Like, should we think about competition in military AI as like a totally separate universe of competition, a different arena? Or do you think that there actually is pretty significant overlap between sort of this kind of competition we've been talking about from an economic standpoint and the sort of type of competition that happens in the military context? And so, yeah, we'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Thanks. Yeah, really great to be here. I want to start by, I think I agree with almost everything that everyone has said so far. I want to start though by ferociously.
To be clear, I'm going to try to find ways to get you all to argue. So
I was just going to get there, Tim. I was
great.
I ferociously disagree with Matt on this one point where he said that people don't have to scrap to get by in academia. Because I'm living the publish or perish life here, Matt. So,
did I say that? My bad. No disrespect.
No, it was in the context of like Chinese firms like not being born out of academia. I don't actually disagree with that statement. Okay, so on the military front, yeah, I would say there's a couple ways to think about this, right? So in terms of, I think there's connections on a broader level between a state's ability to sustain economic growth for the long term as a form of latent power and the ability to convert that into military capabilities. So clearest example of that is you're a more economically wealthy country, you can tax your population more to boost your military capabilities if the need arises. Maybe a more specific and interesting example of that is there's a lot of academic research that has shown that states that are more economically developed actually have better battlefield outcomes. And part of that is maybe being able to have more skilled personnel to operate more advanced weapons. That might be one pipeline. So there is an established connection between increases in economic efficiency and sort of military strength in the long term. And I guess we have seen that with some of these past industrial revolutions that Helen has alluded to, where first the change in leadership comes through a change in economic leadership, and then that over the long term produces a change in the military balance of power. In terms of AI's direct effect on military power, not through the economic channel, I think there are some ways in which you can map out a similar pathway in the economic realm, in the military realm as well. So I'm not an expert on China's military, I think I'd point you to a couple other people who've done really great research in this area, including Elsa Kanya and Laurie Salmon has also done a lot of great research in this area. What I have studied is the pathway by which previous general purpose technologies have affected military power. So we've talked about AI as a general purpose technology with many, many different applications across many different areas. One thing, by the way, that's hard to, why it makes it hard to study GPTs, and when you pose the question to Emily, how do we evaluate the economic effectiveness of some of these measures, is GPTs take a long time to diffuse. They require major structural changes across so many different sectors. It took electricity 40 years to produce a meaningful productivity boost to US manufacturing, and the US was the leader in electrification. So the easy answer to all these questions is it's too early to tell. The more interesting answer is we do know a few things about GPTs and how they diffused in the military realm. We know that they did take a long time. Electricity's path in the military realm was also really slow. We know that oftentimes we focus on the tip of the spear end application rather than sort of the more diffuse things that these GPTs will do throughout the military, like changing logistics, communication. Everybody thought with electricity that there would be electric rays of death that would completely change the battlefield. What actually completely changed the battlefield was electrical communications. Electricity's effect on mass production and the ability for the US essentially to mass produce armaments, which was really essential in both World War I and World War II. So translating that to the AI realm, I'm not saying autonomous weapons don't matter. I'm saying it could very well be the case that some of these same effects of AI on logistics and communications are just as important, if not more important.
Got it. Right. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And again, I think I mean, defense bros is already a term, right? But I do think that that's similar, right? I guess in the sense of our vision for how some of these things play out, may actually look in some ways a lot more boring, but actually be a lot more important, I guess, is Jeff, kind of the point that you're making. So Jeff, maybe I can start with you on kind of one of the Q&As that came in, which I think is a useful theme to kind of bring into this conversation. So David Lambert asks, to what extent is China's domestic regulation, sort of tech company crackdowns and data privacy protection laws, damaging or potentially even helping the potential for China's AI development? And I'm curious to get your take on this, but I think in general, we'd love to kind of bring in the panelists to this question, because I think it indicates in some ways how some of the goals that we've laid out, at least for China, actually sometimes are in tension with one another, right? And that the goal of, for example, enhancing state power may not always come, so nicely with the goal of ensuring national champions in AI. And so, yeah, we'd love if you have any kind of thoughts on that. And then I guess Helen, probably it would be cool to bring you in on that question as well.
Yeah, excuse me. That's a great question. I think, yeah, on the broader trade-off point, exactly right. We've identified all these different goals, right? Military end capabilities, economic strength, prestige. Pretty clearly, maximizing for prestige might directly even trade off with maximizing for economic competitiveness.
Totally. I love a world where China's killing it in terms of doing AI beating Go and all of these kind of basic research tasks, but it's actually quite limited in other stuff, right?
Yeah, and what you see, I think there's a researcher named Galady has an entire book on conspicuous consumption and how the flashy military end objects, including aircraft carriers, by the way, as the prestige objects, but not the ones that actually have military, have a significant boost to, or the most impactful boost to military effectiveness. On David Lambert's question, I would say, my take is that the investments in privacy preserving machine learning techniques, China's recent turn towards more privacy protections, more attention to personal information protection. For me, I don't see that as counterproductive to the spread of AI in China, the diffusion of AI in China, which we've been talking about. And I think part of that is because I see this as a long marathon unfolding across many, many decades. And to win that marathon or to effectively run that marathon, you have to have buy-in from people to accept these technologies. And Chinese people care about privacy too. So to the extent that there is that attention to privacy protection, I think that correlates well with the sustainable development of AI. So I don't see the trade-off there.
Absolutely. Helen, do you want to?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
was
Actually,
just gonna
let's
jump
do
in.
Helen first, and then we'll go back to
Yeah, no, I mean,
see you,
I
Emily.
basically agree with Jeff. I think for me, one thing that's been interesting about this sort of so-called crackdown that we've seen over the past 12-ish months, I don't know. I think it's really showed some of the weaknesses in previous narratives that we had about China. It's really, I don't know, I think in DC in general, we like to think in terms of sort of quick memes or simple summary statements of what's going on. And I think, 3 years ago, it might have been common wisdom that this big advantage that China has in developing AI is, a lack of regulation or a kind of freewheeling regulatory environment. And I think what we've seen more recently is that actually a lot of the pressures that are causing, Europe to develop AI regulation, the US to certainly discuss kind of AI regulation, even if we're further from enacting anything, those pressures apply, just about as much in China as they do elsewhere. And so as Jeff says, things like, if consumers think that tech companies are, scamming them or deceiving them or misusing their personal information, they're not going to be as, willing to use those tech companies. A famous example in China, a big scandal was a Baidu search result that sent, I think it was a young man who was ill and sent him to a sort of disreputable place of treatment. And I forget if he died or probably others on the call remember the details, but he had a bad outcome because he had gone to this thing that Baidu had suggested to him. And that was a huge scandal. And that kind of thing really hurts, people's willingness to use Baidu and to trust its results. And so, yeah, I mean, I think this isn't to say that the Chinese government is going to make the same decisions as, the EU or the US or things like that. But I think it's really important to recognize that, this is this giant ecosystem of many different ways that AI is being used for many different things. And a lot of the kind of new challenges that that's presenting for governments and for consumers and so on are going to be shared across jurisdictions. And China is going to have to figure out, ways to deal with them just like everyone else. They may figure out different solutions, but they're not immune.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that point. I was catching up with a friend last weekend and I was like, yeah, between sort of like China's crackdown, right? Like antitrust discussions in the United States and like GDPR in Europe, it's kind of like policymakers around the world are like, what do we do with these technology companies? Like they seem really scary and unaccountable. We should do something about them. That's like kind of like a shared global consensus in some sense. But Matt, maybe I'll bring you in. I know you want to jump in on this particular question.
Sure. Just, two quick thoughts. Macro thought, I really think it's a huge error to, basically use competition with China as a reason not to regulate our own companies. I think that the worst possible thing that could happen to US tech competitiveness is to, basically have some repeat of 2020 or something like that. And if we think misinformation or monopoly economic, we think any of that is feeding into that, that's the worst possible outcome. And so, I don't like using it as an excuse. On the other hand, I do think that the one maybe less discussed impact of how the sort of regulatory crackdown in China is going to impact their tech ecosystem is that outside of universities, or like if you look at sort of the top AI labs globally, the ones pushing out cutting edge research, almost all of them are tied to big tech companies. And almost all of that is possible, or not almost all that. A big reason that is possible is because these companies can kind of print money with their monopolies. They're just so rich that they just throw money into, oh yeah, just spend the next 15 years, researching autonomous vehicles and just see what happens. Spend 15 years, building foundational models and, don't worry about the price tag. So, in China, where this is, in the US, we have a pretty good buffer around those. We have a long tradition of that. Our companies are very wealthy and they keep funding that. In China, where it's been more on a bit of a knife's edge, Alibaba is willing to invest in its own AI lab until it's not. Tencent is willing to until it's not. And basically, if they break up or severely damage some of these big Chinese tech giants, and basically make it impossible for them to print money. And right now we're seeing a sort of a massive wave of layoffs in Chinese tech that could end up impacting that in a more, I'm not looking at these sort of specific AI regulations, which I think are really interesting and have their own kind of effects. But I do think that that is one knock-on effect. Put it all under the umbrella of don't use China as an excuse not to, do anti-monopoly stuff here, because there's a much bigger concern than, this specific thing. But I do think it's important to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, and I think one of the really interesting outcomes of this is I think points well taken around sort of regulation not necessarily being sort of mutually exclusive, right, with sort of economic success in AI. But I think, Matt, one thing that you are saying is basically that you feel like one way you advance basic research in AI is that you have monopolies. In some ways, the concentration of economic power is a key component to forwarding this kind of research, at least in maybe the modern era. Yeah.
It's like running against a lot of my other hardy feelings about monopolies and stuff like that. I guess what maybe the qualifier would be if you are going to take away one of the major funding mechanisms for cutting edge AI labs, then find another one, find another way to fund that.
So Emily,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. Emily, you wanted to jump in on this as well, right?
Yeah, I just like Matt, I had 2 quick points. I think we're seeing a really interesting thing developing in China right now, where there's this fundamental tension between innovation and the Chinese government obviously wanting to maintain a hold on some of these leading tech companies for a whole host of reasons. And I mean, I worry, if I were sitting in Beijing trying to make policy there, I'd be worried that the Chinese government is not leaving enough room to to take the risk that these companies need in order to stay innovative. Because I mean, there's so much literature out there on the need for, experimentation in order to promote innovation. And I think if the Chinese government is going to kind of continue to latch on and really control the progress of where these companies are going, I think we're going to see China's innovation start to stagnate potentially over the next few years. And just one other quick point that's more specific, I would say, on the recent regulations. I think we're seeing, there was a lot of outrage and a lot of concerns that came out of the US when China's Data Privacy Act came out, or their equivalent of it. I think it came out maybe last summer. But it's one of the it's kind of a really interesting point where you see that people started reading it and they were like, oh, wait, the Chinese government actually cares about companies having people's data. And I guess that's a positive step forward, but I don't understand how this fits with their broader kind of goals. It seems really, it seems different from what we've seen in the past. But I think we're seeing, the US is one of the only, I think off the top of my head, is one of the only countries where citizens care more about the government having your data than companies having your data. And I think, this is a very different phenomenon when we look at Europe, when we look at China and some of the data privacy laws that we've seen start to come out, where again, at least in China, and this is my understanding, I don't know, some of the panelists might disagree, but to me, there's almost a kind of underlying assumption for Chinese citizens that the Chinese government has your data, they have your information, but there's more trust, I would say, for domestic Chinese citizens in their government, how their government is using that data, at least maybe prior to COVID. I don't know necessarily how much that has changed, especially with things happening in Shanghai and elsewhere, versus in the United States, where again, people care less about the data that Facebook has, or the data that, you plug in all this information to sign up for who knows what, Hulu, Netflix, all these other things. But the second the US government wants to track your information, everyone's up in arms. So it's a really kind of interesting phenomenon. I don't necessarily have any really good takes on why I think it's happening. I think there are kind of deep societal issues why people trust one side versus the other. But I think as we see more regulations coming out on China, specifically on data, I think they're going to be closer to what we're seeing in Europe than what we initially thought. And that's just my quick take.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's.
Can I just jump in there?
Yeah, totally. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think it's a really good point. I do think we always have to just say here, it's very hard to conclude that Chinese citizens don't have a problem with, something their government is doing, because it would be censored if they did. But I think Emily's underlying point of, you can look at Europe as a big jurisdiction that is way more concerned about private companies' use of data than about government use of data, as at least a proof of concept of it doesn't have to be the case that that your citizenry is as concerned about, government access as we are in the US.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to go back to picking on Jeff, but before I do, I want to pick on Emily a little bit more, as maybe to put like a little bit of pushback and just see how you kind of respond to it. It kind of strikes me that maybe we're ending up in sort of this weird mirror image of what US grand strategy was towards China in like the 90s, where it feels like the rhetoric then was basically like China's opening up, we need to encourage their open markets because once they adopt open markets, they just won't be able to keep political control, right? And I think in large part, I think there's been a conclusion that that just was not a real thing, right? But I'm curious now if you think that in some ways we are now repeating the same error, but in reverse, right? Which is that we say things like, you know, China has an incentive to control, right, its society in a way that, you know, might not otherwise be the case. And given its system, right, it ultimately will not be able to compete economically, right? Because innovation will just not be able to take off. They won't be dynamic in all the ways that we love for Google, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. And like, do you think, maybe Emily, maybe I'm mishearing what you're saying, but are you trying to make that argument that ultimately, like the control that's necessary for, say, the party to stay in control is ultimately going to kneecap any efforts to make AI sort of a success?
I think that's a piece of it. So I would say that, I mean, China has obviously proven a lot of like previous innovation literature wrong. I mean, there was this kind of fundamental agreement that authoritarian states would not be able to innovate because of X, Y, and Z reasons. And clearly China has shown that that's not the case. It doesn't, you know, democracies can evolve and innovate just as well as autocracies or any other, you know, governance regime.
Yeah, especially if you create a monopoly, right? Like kind of what we're saying is like, yeah, that's the key thing, right?
Yeah,
So,
it kind of is. But I would say, I mean, at this point in time, so to your point about like what we did in the 90s versus what we're doing now in terms of looking at grand strategy towards China, I mean, I think there was, I mean, it's it's like undercorrecting in the 90s and then overcorrecting now.
We can never get it right.
No, and we're kind of it's either there. The biggest issue I think that I see nowadays is that there's no willingness to accept any amount of risk when doing business or, you know, collaborating or doing anything with China. It's either this is a clean, perfectly fine, risk-free enterprise or risk-free investment or whatever, or this is an investment that is going to, you know, it's almost like catastrophic. It's like this is going to, you know, help the Chinese advance their next, you know, whatever unmanned aerial, whatever kind of end of the world. I mean, I've seen stuff about like mind control, AI, brain, you know, all of this stuff. And there's really no talk about what's happening in the in-between. And I think that's one of the issues now where I think moving forward, and I think this has always been the case with China, I think we need to go into collaborations and conversations with China, understanding that there will always be some amount of risk, but putting this risk, I would say, on more of a spectrum and saying, okay, how much risk am I willing to accept in doing this? Like what, you know, we talk a lot about what the Chinese are going to gain from US collaborations or US investment, but we never, or at least from what I'm seeing, there's very little discussion about what the US stands to gain in collaborating with China. I think there are certain instances where we need to collaborate with China for a whole host of reasons, for national security reasons, economic competitiveness reasons, that get washed under the table because they're viewed as just too risky. We can't even talk about it. So I don't know if that answered your question, Tim. I kind of took it in a circle there, but I do think China is usually pretty explicit about what they want to do, their ambitions. I mean, they have 5-year plans, they have 15-year plans.
It's all just there.
It's all just there, often in Chinese language, but it's all there. Not much of it has changed at the like fundamental heart of things. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, I think this is one of the things that Rush Doshi in his book, The Long Game, argues is that like China, I mean, as the title hints at, China has been playing the long game. They've been laying this out. They've been talking about this. Obviously, things have changed a bit under Xi Jinping. Well, more than a bit, where he has kind of doubled down on certain things that previous administrations have been doing, and kind of taken things in his own way. But at the heart of things, I think China has been pretty honest about what they want to do, and U.S. policy has kind of like circled around it. So I'm hoping we can move to that middle ground between the undercorrecting and overcorrecting, but who knows?
Yeah, definitely. Matt, I see you have a hand up. Do you want to jump in on this point? Oh, I think you might be on mute.
My bad.
No worries.
Quick thought on what you were saying of like, you know, mirror image of the 90s and, you know, overcorrecting, undercorrecting. I think it's I think about it much less in terms of like the sort of pseudo absolutes of like this will lead to that, or this, you know, this sort of ideological possibility to that. It's basically like execution. I think that at periods of time, the Chinese government has executed very well on. They've kept the same, you know, clear ideological position, and they've executed well and made like sharp policies that accomplish their goals. And sometimes they're executing very poorly. I think in the 2008 to 2012, it was a lot of kind of shaky execution, a lot of rampant corruption, people very upset, environmental pseudo disaster. And when I moved there in 2010, like everybody who had the chance was like trying to get out. Everyone who could educate abroad, they're trying to get out. And then something in the Xi era that a lot of that started to shift. The domestic ecosystem's taking off, pollution's getting a little bit better, people feel like corruption's getting better, and people are starting to kind of take pride, and you're seeing a little bit more a desire to stay in China, a desire to kind of innovate and do whatever within China. And now from 2017, 18 till the present day, execution has looked, in my opinion, quite shaky. The foreign policy execution has looked very, very shaky. You know, the COVID has kind of gone from like really bad to maybe really good to now really bad. And so all that, I think it's much less about like the ideological position, which pretty much stays the same, and it's whether they're executing. I think right now they're in a period of executing very poorly.
Yeah, and I think it's really intriguing, particularly if you think about like, you know, all the while the state of the art and the technology is evolving, right? But like there's points in that technological evolution which are more critical than others, right? And so there's this kind of interesting thing where like, you know, both the US and China are kind of like up and down and up and down. Part of the question is if they happen to be up at the critical time, right? Seems to be a really big issue of timing. Helen, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think just to kind of expand on something Matt was saying, I sort of think of it here as, I think you can think of China as trying to balance these two goals, where one goal is, you know, an authoritarian like regime stability goal. That's very clearly very important to the CCP. But they also have this goal, you know, they don't want to do that in a way that is extremely closed off and, you know, autarkic and not reliant on the rest of the world. They really do want to be kind of a world leader in science and technology. They want to be advancing. They want to be kind of out there and engaged. And that requires a certain level of interconnection and flow of information and things that makes it difficult to have, you know, they're not doing the North Korea move, basically. They are actually trying to have really world-leading scientists, to have world-leading companies, and that necessitates an amount of flow of, you know, for instance, students going abroad and coming back, you know, access to information. They need their elites to be able to access the global internet, and they don't prevent, you know, they don't prevent that from happening, even though it's a small fraction of the population. Anyway, so I sort of see them as trying to walk this fine line between having enough control that things don't get out of hand, there isn't, you know, significant unrest, and having, you know, enough information control that they can maintain that state, while also having enough sort of freedom and interconnection that they're able to keep this sort of S&T, you know, advancement going, and other kind, you know, commercial, economic, and so on. And I think it's really interesting. I'm not sure to what extent is that a razor edge that they're walking along versus is it a nice, comfortable, you know, saddle point on a nice mountain range that they can stroll along, you know, dance from side to side. But I think that's sort of part of how I interpret some of the dynamics that Matt was describing of, you know, there was this big, I think there was a big shift towards, obviously, you know, more openness, more interconnection. And then the Xi era has sort of been a correction back to, oh no, hang on, maybe that was a little bit too far in that direction. Maybe we need to go a little more the other way. And then to your point, Tim, I don't think this means, you know, if we accept that there's a balance here, and maybe it's not neither a razor's edge nor a super comfortable, you know, saddle, whatever they're called, saddle point in a mountain range, something in between. You know, that doesn't mean we can just relax and say, oh, they're balancing these two forces, and so therefore they're going to struggle. You know, depending on exactly what events we're looking at and what kinds of, you know, things are happening in the international space, it could be that they're able to continue on that balance for long enough that it causes problems for the US or for other countries. So this isn't a like, and everything's fine. But I do think that is a really difficult tension that they're trying to manage, that liberal democracies are much less, you know, there's other tensions that we have to manage, but not that particular one.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is actually like a good, like, I'm glad, like, I'm, by way of context, I mean, when I was at Google like a number of years ago, it felt like a lot of the AI policy discourse was like AI as like the key motivator of a lot of these things, where like AI does all this stuff and like the world responds to it. And I think like now we're moving to, I think, a much more accurate picture in terms of the policy discussion, which is like, there's all these other forces kind of playing out, and AI sort of just kind of like floats on the surface of it in some ways, right? It's kind of subject to a lot of these other forces. And then maybe just be a better model for kind of thinking about how the technology kind of evolves and is treated. So Jeff, I promised to come back to picking on you, and I'd like to do that now. Jeff, I kind of started with maybe a little bit of the provocation to Emily, where I said, look, China's pursuing this because of its desire for economic revitalization. Like, is that actually happening, right? And I think, Emily, your response, if I heard you right, was like, no, the picture's a little muddled. It's working in some places, not working in others. And then, Jeff, your rejoinder to my question was basically like, Tim, your time frame is too short. It's just defined by like the white paper of the moment. Let me tell you how AI really works. AI is like electricity. It's going to take 3 years to play out. We won't know the effects until 30, 40 years from now. I'm curious from your point of view, like, is a policy prescription from what you're saying that the US should just wait and see on a bunch of these things? Like that it's impossible to predict these effects that we're talking about here because it's something like electricity. And so it's like very difficult to figure out what your strategy should be given that huge uncertainty over such large timeframes. I don't know if that is kind of what you're pushing at, or if you'd push back on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I like this model of you like doing this panel as a schoolyard bully, and you're just like picking on all of us.
I mean, you're also agreeable that I figured I got to be the jerk. So
yeah. And I also I came to this talk to learn about China tech, and Helen is bringing this geographical knowledge. So I'm like, this is great. So let me just say, first of all, actually 2 years ago, gosh, maybe 3 years ago now, US-China Economic and Security Review Commission asked me to testify on assessing China's relative AI capabilities in this space. And they always ask you to come up with policy recommendations at the end. And my recommendation was actually the status quo is a decent option for the US. And you have to prove to me that whatever big policy plan you're coming up with is better than the status quo, where I think the US is in a pretty good position. So that some support to the wait and see approach. A couple of things I'll say in addition to that is the reason why the wait and see approach works, or the case for it, is that's what happens in a decentralized innovation ecosystem. And so it's not necessarily about authoritarian versus democratic. It's do you have a decentralized or centralized approach to scientific and technological development? We've seen a lot of empirical evidence that shows that decentralized economies, especially in response to technology trajectories that are shifting very, very quickly, where you pick one winner, like Japan did with the 5th generation computer project, where they picked big mainframe type computers and architectures to build around when the world was shifting to personal computers. Sure, you have a long-term plan, you're in the long game, but you chose the wrong thing. So that's why same thing with boring stuff like education and setting up disciplines for computer science education. China has picked the approach of, we're going to set up an AI major. That might work if sort of the centralized uniform curriculum that you're trying to set up through that approach just happens to hit. Most of the time it's not going to hit. It's not going to be able to adjust quickly in time to where the field is going. So yeah, I'm fine with the wait and see decentralized approach. That doesn't mean there aren't useful policy things to do. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying I think there's a lot of legs to stand on for that approach. And oftentimes it's hard for us to say, you write a policy paper and you're like, oh, do nothing. But maybe that's the right answer sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. I love that anecdote because I think in that testimony, they really want you to be like, how do we win this race, this AI, race that we're in? And I feel like your response is we're not in a race. It's more of an AI interpretive dance. Or it's it's kind of the game that you think you're in is actually not the game at all. I guess Matt, Helen, Emily, I mean, do you agree with sort of Jeff's, I'm mischaracterizing you a little bit, but kind of a little bit of a laid back approach here, right? Is this policy work relevant? Should we all go home, right? In some ways, there's a lot of uncertainty here. Or do you feel there are things we know, there are things that we should be more aggressive on, it is possible to have grand strategy in this space. Like, it feels like there's this question about knowing here, which is actually really key. And Emily, you got a hand up, so I'll let you jump in.
Sorry, my mouse died.
All good.
So I would say that I don't necessarily disagree with the whole kind of sit back and wait thing. But I will say, I do think there needs to be a bit of like a stepping back and thinking from a US policy perspective about what we're doing before we do it. I know that sounds very like basic, but I think one of the things I worry about, particularly in the context of like export controls and sanctions, is that there's, I mean, I kind of laugh. I've talked to folks who have been doing export controls and sanctions for decades, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, the work I do is like on like the front page of the New York Times. And like all of a sudden everyone's talking about export controls, and they kind of laugh and they're like, I can't believe this has become the.
I mean, is it like kind of hipster where they're like,
it is like, I was here first, kind of, yes, exactly. But I think as it's become such a like prominent conversation, particularly obviously with Russia, but particularly in the context of China, since the Trump administration did everything with Huawei and ZTE, I would say I worry that tools like that are longstanding tools that have existed for decades and have been used effectively in very targeted ways are now being used in broader strokes and kind of, I don't want to say willy-nilly ways, but like kind of like that, like they're kind of like, oh, let's just use this to cut this off, or let's use this and we can kind of control the flow of capital here, or things like that. And I think one of the, so if we call like export controls and sanctions the kind of protect, defend side of our approach to China, there also is a conversation then about, okay, so there's a disagreement now between the like run faster, promote side of competition and the protect and defend side. And I've seen people talking about one should come before the other, or like we should be really focusing on fixing our own system before we go out and start punishing China's or stopping China's or Russia's or whoever else. And to me, I kind of think I'm like, why can't these things happen simultaneously? And I think they need to happen simultaneously. For instance, and I'm not advocating for this as an approach, but I know there are people who are. If you're thinking about targeted visa bans on certain types of Chinese students, let's say if they're getting money from the Chinese government to come and study in the US, you can go ahead and block those certain students from getting visas. Or you could think on a run faster approach and say, okay, we're going to block you from getting money to come to the US from the Chinese government, but we're going to find a way to give you money from our government or from our companies or from our universities to come here and study. And that's like I think that's a good example of showing like the run faster and the protect and defend thing working in tandem. And I feel like that concept is kind of getting overlooked. It's very much like it has to be one or the other. One has to come first, then the second one is very much secondary, and we have to think about it only on like, very, very specific cases. So I would just say, and to tie it back to Jeff's point about like the waiting and seeing, I would say my version of waiting and seeing is stepping back and making sure that the tools we are using are the most effective and the most relevant tools for this situation. And, in some instances, things have changed. Maybe in this case, we don't have a tool that's effective to deal with this. And maybe that means it's time to reinvent the wheel. I kind of joke that the current policy that's used to define fundamental research for classification. So if something needs to be classified or not, is called NSDD 189, and it came out during the Reagan administration. And I kid you not, like it refers to the threat posed by the Eastern Bloc as a reason to classify fundamental research. And I'm like, you could go back and forth. There are people who agree and disagree about whether or not we should modernize some of these policies. But I mean, taking a step back and thinking about where we might need to reinvent the wheel, that's one that I usually point to and say, okay, we're not worried about the Eastern Bloc anymore. Let's think about modernizing some of our, for instance, research security policies so we can not only deal with the here and now, but also create policies that are not country specific or target specific, but can kind of, stand the test of time.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a point well taken. Yeah, and I think, Emily, your points actually point to like almost like an offensive use of the Ding doctrine, if you will, which is basically like you sit back while your adversary overthinks the technology and puts all these regulations in place. And then you win because like they actually become less dynamic. They make the wrong bets, Helen, Matt, I don't know if you have any kind of other comments you would want to add to this before, we move to another question.
Just a quick comment on that. I definitely feel Jeff's pain on the like they want to say like what can we do? Where can we change something?
I
And
want
sometimes
3
the answer is
bullets.
not that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to basically watch the field of sort of US China AI, blank competition, whatever you want to call it, watch it develop over like a 5-year span. And I think that the policy work has proved very important in a couple different ways. It doesn't always lead to a do this right now, but maybe the 2 ways that I think it's been most helpful is like thinking out second, third, fourth order consequences of actions. And then also just like providing data that becomes like an underlying foundation for a discussion. So like a lot of the discussions about, Chinese students coming to the US, do they stay here? Do they go back? Da, da, da. Like I was in those discussions for years and I was using anecdotal observations of people that I met in Beijing and that I met in California. And I'm like, I think this is kind of what's going on. And then I think that overall there, from a lot of work or conversations or anecdotes, there's this idea, okay, no, they're all coming here, they're all learning and then taking all that back and then they're building China and we need to do something about that. And that was feeding into a lot of like real actionable policy things. And I think Jeff, we worked together, I don't know what it was, 2018, starting to do some on a project on China AI, and Jeff came up with this methodology of looking at sort of the top research conferences and where did those people publishing at the top AI research conferences, where are they right now and where did they go to undergrad and where did they go to PhD? And that work, he sort of introduced it, or at least he introduced it to me. I think some others had done something like it. And then the next year we kind of built on it a little bit. The next year we built on it a lot and eventually kind of came out with a research finding of that, at least for the top AI conferences, the Chinese students who are, or the people who did their undergrad in China and who are publishing at those conferences, the overwhelming majority of them are coming to the US and staying in the US. That's not a universal finding. There are still a lot of Chinese people coming here, going back, starting companies, but it was getting a data foundation to something that I had been like observing very closely for many years, but didn't have the data for. And it's very, very policy relevant. We're making decisions right at that point in time about letting Chinese students come in, letting them stay, what are the green card, everything. And maybe the data, maybe at the very end of the day, the data said actually, yeah, don't change anything or kind of go back to where we were a few years ago. But it could have come out the other way. It could have been a totally different finding and that would have suggested other things. So I think, policy work is important. Fund it, all the funding, think tanks, universities, give it all. And then, yeah, I just think that kind of second, third, fourth order assessments and the actual like data foundation for things that we're just kind of gesturing at before are the real advances.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this makes me think I really want to create like a think tank called like the Status Quo Institute or something like that, where every white paper would just steadfastly on any policy issue will just be like, it's okay, So in the last kind of 15 minutes or so, I want to kind of turn to one, maybe 2 questions, depending on how the panelists kind of engage with it. I think one thing I really want to think about is, okay, we've sort of set the stage, obviously, with what China is doing. An obvious question, which you've already got into, is like how the US should sort of respond. And I do think that, if the 2 arenas, to use Helen's framework, apply, right, which is like China really wants to compete internationally in prestige and compete internationally in sort of economic prominence, right? I am sort of interested in like how the US should think about the prestige game in AI. Does it matter? Should it be something that we're investing in? Because there's almost one view, which is very realpolitik, which is basically to say, look, you can have all the like Go playing AI that you want. If we can win on practical applications to industry, then like we really win this game, right? And so, I mean, I'd love to kind of get the panelists, your all's thoughts on like the prestige game in AI internationally. Is that a game that the US should be investing in? Like, do we care about it? Like, if so, why?
Can I make one note before Helen, I'll give this to you after, but I think one of the things we should talk about is AI obviously incorporates a lot of different sectors, fields, and everything. And I think there are certain sectors of AI, for instance, surveillance technology, that the US should not care if China reaches the level of prestige that they are the #1 global supplier in surveillance technology. There are just certain parts of AI and tech competition with China that the US doesn't even need to enter into. I think it goes against our values to do so. So I'll just throw that out there and pass it to Helen.
Right. Like there's like games we're not even playing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Helen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was going to make the case that the prestige game really matters, the way I would do it would be via top talent, via the best researchers. Because certainly, I think this is a big reason that companies are investing a ton in this. AI is a really unusual domain of scientific research in that normally you have universities doing basic research and publishing their findings, and then you have companies doing applied research and not publishing their findings. And in AI, it's actually really standard so you have Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Tencent, Baidu, ByteDance, big companies paying, giant salaries to bring on AI researchers and then letting them publish their findings openly. And a big part of why that happens is because there's so much competition for the best of the best. And those researchers insist on being able to share their work openly. So that dynamic is definitely there, but then that just sort of pushes the question like one layer down, which is like, okay, and how much does it matter if you have the top AI talent for whether you can actually deploy these systems?
Yeah.
And I mean, I sort of think that we sort of don't have a great answer to that yet. And I think it'll be interesting to watch over the next 5 or 10 years kind of how that plays out. I think there are definitely a ton of areas of AI where you don't actually, in order to apply AI to your product or service, you don't actually need the most cutting edge advances. You need something from a few years ago, everything's published openly. So it's easy to like adapt something from, 2 or 3 years ago. And you need to know enough about the domain, that you're applying it to. And there's always a ton of, gnarly details about like, okay, we're using AI for this like particular production line. And so it's going to really depend on like, the lighting in the factory and the, like, what is the contrast between the different, whatever. There's always like tons of details for any given application. It's an open question to me to what extent we're going to see really advanced systems or really, cutting edge systems leading to better sort of capacity to apply and profit from those technologies. I think maybe the best examples we have so far are a lot of the internet company examples. So things like if you have the best recommender systems, that's going to let you sort your newsfeed better. It's going to let, ByteDance is famous for, the TikTok algorithm just being really, really good at predicting what videos people are going to want to watch, which, is actually a pretty significant commercial advantage for them. Maybe a little bit more connected to the sort of fundamental research would be Google as well, using kind of cutting edge natural language processing techniques. So large language models to improve Google search and to keep going. Though I don't know, I also feel like Google search there's a bunch of issues with it these days. So who knows if that's actually
despite the brightest minds on earth working on the problem.
Yeah. So I think definitely like a very clear reason to care about prestige and a
Sure.
reason that companies clearly do is for talent. And then there's this other question of how much does actually having cutting edge talent and having researchers at your company who publish at the top conferences, like how well does that flow through into your bottom line? And I would guess that the answer is something like, yeah, it flows through to some extent, but I'm not aware of like really solid analysis of that question.
Yeah, that analysis I would love to see and think about. I think it's in some ways a big question as to whether or not these two arenas are related in any way, or if they really are kind of like decoupled in a certain way. I also love the idea that if like the national prestige game in AI is really around talent, then like we're really talking about like a geopolitical game of like nerd sniping, which is like who can present the most interesting problems to lure the best researchers to us.
And
like
who
something
can
we
like,
don't really,
I mean, something that China has done is doing increasingly well is who can present the best, like, best offer to a junior professor to say like, okay, come to this lab and we'll give you this many dollars and this many junior people beneath you and this much freedom to do such and such. They're clearly very actively kind of recruiting folks back, and they can give them really great conditions to do that. So I think that is very much something that's happening.
Sure.
I guess one other thing that I think that we haven't talked about as much, I think it is important not to neglect the military angle too much, and I think there's a similar question. Similar to this question of like, okay, if Facebook has like the top, some top researcher, how much does that help them, earn money on Facebook? There's a similar question of, okay, how do the prestige dynamics around top researchers influence your sort of, military industrial complex and the kinds of systems that you're able to build and how well you can keep up militarily as well. But to me, that's also an open question.
Yeah, for sure. Jeff, Matt, any thoughts on this before we move to the next question or? No, great. So again, if you have any audience questions, you should definitely be sort of submitting them. I'm seeing a couple of them come in, and I'm kind of selecting which ones will be good for like the last 10 minutes here. I think one to pick up on, which I think is a really great audience question, is basically this question that asks, how transferable is China's AI expertise outside of China? In other words, for example, like if Chinese companies are great at natural language processing for Mandarin, does that mean are they going to be any good for English or European languages? Or is like facial recognition of like Chinese ethnicities transferable to Western faces? I think that is kind of a quite interesting question in terms of like national competition, is like how much of the domain expertise in AI is really kind of deeply cultural in some sense. And like whether or not that limits the ability for national champions to become international champions in some ways. I don't know if anyone has any kind of views on sort of transferability. And of course, the question really comes down to like what capability you're talking about. But it would be great to get people's thoughts on that.
I can jump in. I'll give a brief answer. I think the AI skills are very transferable. Would be my understanding of how the technology works. If you're good at facial recognition, that'll work on, you can do that on any kinds of faces. If you're good at natural language processing, you can do that on any language. I think there's a whole other conversation I'd actually be really interested in maybe especially Matt's take on this about corporate culture and things like that. And the 996, working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week in Chinese culture, companies, entrepreneurial mindset. How okay is it to try something big and fail? That would be my guess of the types of area, in a research lab, a scientific lab, an academic lab. What is the power balance between supervisors and junior folks, and what are the expectations around what kinds of things are acceptable? That would be my guess of the types of things that are less transferable, as opposed to the machine learning skills specifically.
Yeah, totally. And I think one thing I've thought about a lot is basically is national competitiveness going to depend on whether or not you have a lot of UX designers at your company? Like it actually turns out that it may actually be really unrelated to like basic research and a lot more of like, can you build a product that people will actually use? But Matt, you got name checked. I don't know if you want to chime in.
Sure. Yeah. I'd say, there's like the product, there's the technical skills, and there's like the kind of expansion of companies into different markets. I'd say product wise, you do need to, in many cases, at least, you do need to retrain those products for new markets if they look a lot different. Autonomous vehicles is the one that I like to think of. Driving in Menlo Park and driving in Beijing, very different things. And they're trained to think of how people will react, how cars will react in different situations, and make decisions based on that. The sort of the core might be the same, but you are going to need to retrain that with data. I think that Helen's answer about like corporate cultures and stuff is very good. And you're pointing to UX design. Like this is just a really, really fundamental long-term advantage of the US, is that we have people from all over the world here. And those people are invaluable at helping US companies go abroad, helping them localize, helping them understand different, cultures for their products. And I think that's one where China's really, really going to have a hard time catching up. They have proven, I looked a fair amount at sort of kind of Chinese apps in like the global South, or Chinese apps in India, Southeast Asia, places like that. I'd say they do perform kind of surprisingly well. ByteDance has ByteDance, owner of TikTok, has like the top news app in Indonesia. And, dozens of other examples with often obscure apps that we've never heard of, as well as ones that we have like TikTok. But I do think that like long-term, that kind of localization and product stuff is it's a big thing. Maybe in the US, we're a little bullheaded sometimes, say everyone use our product and it's going to look exactly the same way because we made the perfect thing in Palo Alto. But yeah, I think it's tough on the long term.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it goes to, right, machine learning, you talk a lot about like the representation, right? Like what is the machine learning system actually learning? And I think in part, the like competition in markets here is like revealing a lot about what is transferable, what is not transferable. Like you're saying with cars, right? Like driving culture is so different that you actually literally need the machine to learn again, right? Whereas like facial recognition is like a task that like, obviously has some trouble transferring, but it's like, the commonality of faces makes it more possible to compete there. And like, I think maybe one middle ground, which is interesting to consider is like recommendation engines, right? Like, is the success of TikTok in the United States a demonstration that like behavioral recommendation is like universal in this really intriguing way? Jeff, I saw you had a hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, one quick point on the transferability. I think with even the large language models that are as foundational of AI as we have right now, the L in natural language processing still matters a lot. OpenAI's GPT-3 might have trouble playing in the Chinese language market just because it was trained on English language text, and all the Chinese versions of GPT-3 are trained on Chinese language text. We have low resource languages that you can't actually build these sorts of large foundational models. So I think there's something to be said about the transferability. Can I say, I want to say one quick thing to Anne's question in the chat, and it's a bit of a spicy take. So it's kind of a little bit
spicy is great.
Polite to drop it right at the end. But I think, she's talking about a really good point of like, can we assume Chinese students funded with US money, or like in the case of Emily's example, Chinese government scholarship with Chinese government money, are not subject to the police power of their state with sort of that mandate that they provide info to the government. So all these concerns about tech transfer, espionage, all that looped in. So she asks, what are the long-term costs, the threats we're not thinking about right now when we correct towards liberalization of relations with China, SNT, and AI? And these are really relevant discussions happening in Congress right now about there might be a new like data protection legislation addressing these things. The thing I want to say, and I haven't thought about this clear enough, but it's like, what are the long-term threats of not correcting towards more liberalization to Chinese SNT and AI? And one historical example is all the best and the brightest US students used to go to Germany to study in the late 19th century, until Germany realized, hey, there's too many foreign funded students here. They're all going back to the US and starting their own chemistry programs. We're gonna cut the ability of foreign students to enroll in German universities. That signaled and was in part of a big drive toward militarism, nationalism, and we sort of know the big consequence that came next when those two forces collide. So if you're telling me that preventing Chinese students with maybe military connections or with a Chinese government scholarship, preventing them from studying to the US is so important to national security that it's like that outweighs the chilling effect that comes, the signal that it sends to political forces that are fueling xenophobia in the US right now, to the point where a poll I think released yesterday said 33% of American adults believe that Asian Americans are more loyal to their country of origin than to the US. So I was born in Shanghai. So if we had 80 people on this call at one point, if the people on this call are representative of the US national population, according to this survey, 24 of you would have thought that I'm more loyal to China than the US right now. So you're telling me that the visa ban on Chinese students on government scholarships is so important to national security that it's worth fueling those forces. There's broader forces in play than just like playing around with policies in a vacuum, right? So it's worthy of a debate, but let's not forget the long-term costs of not responding, not liberalizing science and technological ties with China as well. I don't mean to pick on Anne's question, but it's just like something that a little bit off the top of my head, but
yeah, for sure. I think it's a point well taken, and I think it is a kind of classic problem with some of these issues where it's basically like the salient harm versus like the much bigger but amorphous benefit, right? Where basically like a case of espionage is like something that policymakers can really put their hands around, right? But it doesn't actually represent like the actual balance of like benefits and risks here. But Emily, do you want to take us home? We got one more minute.
I was just going to say quickly, I wholeheartedly agree with Jeff. I think we need to think more about the benefits that Chinese students, particularly in science and technology, and this is not just Chinese students, I would say this is Chinese scholars, is Chinese researchers who are going into industry here, professors who also want to come here. I mean, I think one of the statistics I usually point to is that I think in chemistry PhD programs in the United States, Chinese students make up something like 20-ish% of the population. So imagine if we tomorrow turned around and blocked all Chinese students in STEM from getting PhDs in the United States, you'd be losing 20% of the future of chemistry, very advanced chemistry research in the United States. So there are some hard statistics that you can put behind this. But I mean, I think, if we're going to split this again down the line of the like protect, defend, promote, run faster, I think on the promote and run faster, we need to think more about improving opportunities. And I think this, and now I'm going to preach a little bit on the visa issue. I think
and I do want to be careful of time too. So
okay, I will say just quickly that there are plenty of opportunities to make it easier for international students, both from China and from everywhere else in the world, to come here, start companies here, be part of US innovation. And I think right now we have a lot of, we're pushing more on the stopping them from coming here instead of giving them the opportunities that would actually benefit us moving forward. So I won't keep going on that, but I think that's a really important issue, and I'm glad that Jeff brought it up.
yeah, definitely. Well, points well taken, and thanks for all the panelists for joining me today. And yeah, really appreciate everybody's time and attention. I thought we had a great discussion, and I think got to blow up a lot of the myths that are in this space. So appreciate everyone's time, and thank you for joining.